Revolvers. A certain subset of the gun community really loves revolvers. So I posed the question, why, on Patreon yesterday. And I got a cornucopia of different responses. I thought I would go through a little point and counterpoint, little discussion of revolvers, their advantages, some of the reasons you guys love revolvers. That's what we're going to talk about today on Gunfighter Life. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, ballistics, the right way with God Almighty at the center, biblical Judeo-Christian values, and real-world firsthand experience. I am blessed to be your host. Military, law enforcement, private security, contracting, competition shooting, hunting, and some other stuff in there, bullet points in the show notes. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle, because God is number one in everything. This podcast is no different. Let's start talking about revolvers. Now, I try and look at guns soberly as tools. Now, I love guns for their aesthetic value, their art, their things like that, right? I can appreciate the historical value of historic firearms and what they did for us in history, right? But I don't go duck hunting with a blunderbuss just because the people that landed in Jamestown may have. I love history. I live out here in the Wild West, right? I don't ride a Conestoga wagon to work because that's what the people that settled this country got around in. I look at guns as practical tools. And I don't think the revolver is obsolete. I would say it's obsolescent or antiquated. But I think they're disproportionately loved in the community, in the gun world. So why is that? Why are they so loved? That's the question that I posed to the community, to Patreon. And if you're not on Patreon, you're missing out on stuff like this because I open this to the public. You can join as a free member. And a lot of the posts like this that are just questions or polls are free for everybody. So let's take a look at this, shall we? Now, I posted it as a poll and open for comments. So if we go to that, what are the reasons you love revolvers? Nostalgia, perceived dependability, perceived durability, no magazine, flexible loadings. You just love, or you love 357 or 44 Magnum or other comment. And I got 16 comments. So some of those are me replying to people, but 16 comments. That's a lot for a post for me. Okay, the number one pick, why do you love revolvers? Nostalgia. That was the number one. That's why most people love revolvers, nostalgia, which is great. And nostalgia can be great, right? I like 90s country and I like 2000s punk rock, mostly for nostalgia, right? Not because it's the best music ever. But that's a little bit different than something I'm using to keep myself or somebody that I love or a woman or a child alive and breathing. Nostalgia is not enough for me in that category. But nostalgia is the number one reason. Which, if you just want a gun to shoot and have fun with or just have, nostalgia is a fine reason, right? It's your money. You do what you want. Enjoy the good of your labor, the Bible says, right? Ecclesiastes, I think a very underread book for a lot of Christians, sadly, but a lot of wisdom in there. Enjoy the fruit of your labor. That's a good thing. I wouldn't say nostalgia is a number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10 criteria for a life-saving tool. But if you just want one to have because it's pretty and you want to have a revolver, that's fine. Like, enjoy the good of your labor. Nostalgia. The next one, perceived dependability. I would say this is perceived. I worded it that way on purpose. I think prima facie this is false on its face. They're not more dependable. Revolvers are not more dependable than semi-autos. It comes from the grain of truth. I think this was true a long time ago, but since the 1911 trials in 1911 or 1910, whenever the trials were, right? The 1911 went something like 6,000 rounds without a malfunction. Okay, that pretty much puts to bed that revolvers are more reliable than semi-autos. Revolvers can and do break. They can and do malfunction. I think most people that think that they don't shoot them enough. It's not uncommon to go to a training class with a handgun and shoot several thousand rounds in a week. Most people will never put several thousand rounds to a revolver. They just don't shoot them that much. So since they shoot them very little, they think they don't malfunction. But they absolutely do malfunction. They absolutely do break. As somebody that's had them break, they absolutely do break. They are a lot more complicated machine than most modern semi-autos. If you don't believe me, look at an exploded view, right? Every single part taken apart inside, let's say a Smith & Wesson, whatever, K-frame, L-frame, doesn't even matter, does it? A double single action revolver. Look at all the parts laid out on a table, all the springs, all the little tiny pieces, and then look at the parts of a Glock or a Smith & Wesson M&P. We stick same brand, Smith & Wesson M&P versus a Smith & Wesson K-frame. Look at all the parts. The revolver is a lot more complicated. And for every little part, that's a potential for something to go wrong. So perceived dependability was really low on the list. It got very few on that. Perceived durability, also very, very little on that. And I put perceived on there. Durability, every time you shoot a gun, period, you are one round closer to that gun never working again. Every single gun that's ever been made has a total round count, at which point it will break. I don't know what that is. For some guns, that round count is 1. For some guns, that round count may be 100,000. But every round you shoot is one round less. And I think the average good semi-auto handgun will go longer than the average revolver, because the more you shoot a revolver, the closer it's going to getting out of time. That's something that happens with revolvers. And when a revolver goes out of time, you pretty much can't fix it on your own unless you're a really competent gunsmith. So I don't think they're as durable as a semi-auto, but people tend to have that idea, I think, a lot because they don't shoot them as much. But perceived durability, that was pretty low. No magazine. This was fairly high in the votes. No magazine. Okay, yeah. So that is a real thing, right? If you only have one magazine, and you're out hiking or something, and you hit the magazine release, which can happen when you're moving around doing stuff in the real world, and you're busy or you're moving quickly, you don't realize it, and you go to use your gun and you have one round. That's a bad day. That's not going to happen with a revolver, and that's a real thing. My argument to that would be have multiple magazines. Like, why do you only have one magazine? That doesn't really make a lot of sense. I can't really remember the last time I left the house and only had one magazine for my gun or whatever, but that is a real thing. They don't take magazines. And talking about durability, I don't think a revolver itself is more durable, but a cylinder in a revolver is certainly more durable than even the most durable magazine, unless you go crazy off the rails with some dirt cheap, Chinese revolver or something. The average revolver cylinder is going to be more rugged than the average magazine. So there is that. That is actually a thing. So that's a fair point. You're talking about no magazine. Now, the obvious disadvantage to that is you're generally talking 6 rounds versus 15 to 17 rounds in a magazine. So that's a big deal. Plus, changing out the ammo is a lot slower. But the no magazine thing, if you think that's an advantage, and in some situations it can be. Flexible loading. This is a real advantage. To a revolver. With a semi-auto, let's take a 9mm, whether you're talking 115 grain at 1250 feet per second or 147 grain at 990 feet per second, right? You're splitting hairs there. You need a certain amount of power to reliably cycle that action. Too little and you get problems, too much and you get problems. Now, a revolver, since you have to manually make that work. It's not dependent on that. So you can go super powder puff loads unless you have some other kind of problem with your ammo. You could go just enough so that the bullet exited the barrel. It could exit the barrel and then drop to the ground a foot in front of the gun, and the gun would still function. Or you could load it super hot until you get to the point where you're rupturing cases or something, and the gun, again, should work just fine. So you do get a lot more flexibility. You can load really low powder puff 38 specials. Let's take, for instance, a 38 special 357, or really hot hard cast 180 grains. And as long as there's no other problem with your ammo, like seating depth or them jumping the crimp or something, which can happen in a revolver and does happen in revolvers, unless there's an issue like that, it should handle both equally well. So flexibility and loading, that's a solid point. Let's look again. What else do we have here? The other one that got a lot of votes was you just love 357 or 44 Magnum. Like, you just love that load, and those loads work. Not that there aren't any, right? You could get a 44 Magnum Desert Eagle or a Auto Mag or something, but in general, they're going to be in revolver. So, or a Kunin, I guess. But you just love 357. You're just in love with it, or you're just in love with 44 Magnum, and you love them, and therefore you love revolvers because they chamber those, and you think that the 357 is the best handgun round that's ever been made. So, therefore, you love revolvers. That got a decent amount of votes. And then this is where we get the interesting part. Other, and then comments. And I got a lot of comments. So let's look at them. Fixed sights to a fixed barrel. Legit. That's a legit point. So my counterpoint to this is, yeah, but the cylinder is not fixed. And the cylinder has 6, if we're talking about a regular revolver, you have 6 different chambers. And those have to be perfectly aligned. And unless you're talking about like a Freedom's Arms gun, they're probably not always perfectly aligned. So you could have some cylinders, some chambers in a cylinder that are really, really good, and some that are less good. So as far as accuracy goes, yeah, you do have fixed sights on a fixed barrel. That's an accuracy advantage. But the fact that you have to have 6 independently bored cylinders that have to rotate, and then you get into timing issues, that is a major disadvantage. So if you're talking fixed barrel, fixed sights on a single shot break open, yeah, that's pretty legit as far as accuracy. If you're talking about a revolver, you still have the cylinder, and the cylinder is one of the more complex things to machine. A lot more complicated than one barrel, one chamber, which you get on a semi-auto. Your issue there is the tightness of the lockup. If it locks up super tight, then the barrel and sights thing should not really be an issue if you get like a Barstow Precision barrel. But or something like it. But yeah, fixed sight, fixed barrel. But my counterpoint to that is, again, the complexity and the different chambers for every single round in the cylinder. Ammo commonality with a carbine, that is an advantage if you run that. But it's not an advantage over semi-auto because there are plenty of carbines that run 10 millimeter, plenty of carbines that run 9 millimeter. So you could get the same thing in a semi-auto. So I'm not sure how that's an advantage for a revolver unless it's an advantage for you. Like you have a 44 carbine and a 44 revolver. But I've talked about this before, and that's more of a romantic idea than a practical idea, in my opinion. You look at what one of those lever action 44 carbines or 45 long Colt carbines, and I've had those before, and I don't have them anymore because they weigh as much or more than a lot of modern guns, because lever actions were designed in the 1800s and they have a lot of wood and steel, and that's heavy. They weigh as much as a modern fighting carbine, which fires proper rifle rounds instead of pistol rounds. So I'd rather have the proper tool for the job. So I think it's more of a romantic idea. Plus, even if you're running the same caliber, the ammunition that's going to do really well out of your 357 Magnum revolver for defense is probably not very good out of your carbine because you're getting more velocity and you have to balance that penetration and expansion. So you're probably going to want different ammo in your carbine than you are in your revolver. So yeah, it may technically fire, but that doesn't mean it's a very good choice. So again, I think more of a romantic idea than a practical idea. Here's the one that we got off on rabbit holes. You don't leave behind any cases. So there's a lot into this. You don't leave behind any cases with the revolver. And the only real advantage I can see to this in the real world is you don't have to pick up your brass. You can put it in your hand, and then if you're going to reload it, you put it in a coffee can or whatever you do. Which, yeah, bending over to pick up brass is kind of a pain in the butt. If you're talking about it as far as forensics go, here's the deal, guys. If you get in a shooting, it should be a righteous shooting. Period. Like whether you're going to shoot somebody or not should never be based on whether you're going to leave behind cases. If you have to shoot somebody, that should be the least of your problems. And also, there's so many other things, even if that was the case. Like, your projectiles have the rifling cut in them, and the projectiles are what's going to kill the person. So the fact that you don't leave behind any cases is not a thing that I can ever think of in any police case ever, as far as there was no other evidence, but that got them. I don't, maybe that's ever been a thing, but it's probably more of a thing on TV than an actual thing. But again, if you're getting in a shooting, it has to be a righteous shooting. You should give very little care to you leaving your cases behind. And the guy came back to my counter argument about, but your projectiles have the rifling in them. And he says, some of my guns predate serial numbers with their revolver, so how would they know? Well, they know because they get the gun and they would fire it and get the ballistics off of it. That's how that works. That's not really a mystery. Like, if you're the suspect, they get your gun and they compare the ballistics of it. So that doesn't matter whether the gun has a serial number or not. Serial numbers are kind of a moot point. It doesn't really matter, and that's not really a thing unless you live in a state that's so infringy they record your serial numbers, which is not really a thing as far as I'm aware. But they would know because they get your gun and fire it and be like, that's the gun that shot the dude. So serial numbers don't really matter at all in that case. Anyway, deep rabbit hole there. Let's move on. And another one is powerful loads like 44 Magnum and up. And yeah, this is a real advantage, right? So if you are, and 44 Mag is a good place, right? We can sit here and argue about which one's better, 357 or 40 Smith & Wesson. One's got a little bit heavier, can have a little bit heavier bullet. One's in a semi-auto, one's in a revolver, but they're pretty comparable as far as power goes and ballistics go, 10 millimeter versus 357. What you probably shouldn't debate, because you'd look like a fool, is that 10 millimeter is the equivalent to 44 Magnum. It's not. It's not even close. 44 Magnum is more powerful. And when you get into 44 Magnum and up, yeah, the revolver makes a lot more sense because the revolver handles those rounds really well. If you get bigger than that in a semi-auto, you go to something retarded and ridiculous like a Desert Eagle, which is a beautifully made gun, but they're not practical at all. They're just way too big. The grips are way too big. They're not easy to be fired well. The ergonomics are horrible. You're trying to force a square peg in a round hole. Just go to a revolver. If you're going 44 Magnum or bigger, yeah, for sure. And that's one of the reasons, one of the revolvers that I have a 454 Casull, because if I want a round that powerful for elk hunting with a handgun or whatever I'm doing with that gun, yeah, that revolver makes more sense there than a semi-auto. So yeah, if you're going 44 Magnum and up, for sure. Now, you're probably not EDCing a 44 Magnum. This is not Dirty Harry. This is the real world. This is not some, Hollywood fantasy. But if you are going to use 44 Magnum and up, for sure, something that powerful, the revolver definitely has an advantage, right? The rounds are not held in the grip, so you don't have to worry about the size of the cartridge. You also don't have to worry about, the proper cycling, because, again, the gun is not dependent on the round for the cycling. You manually have to do that. So, yeah, if you're going 44 Magnum and up, for sure, that can be an advantage. So, to be fair, revolvers do have some real-world advantages. Some other ones I didn't point out or that weren't brought up is that you can put the muzzle in contact with something and continue to pull the trigger. That's a good point. My counterpoint to that would be that if you grab the cylinder, then you can't even fire one round. So it's just different than a semi-auto with that. Another big real-world advantage is these very small, lightweight J-frames and their power-to-weight ratio. For something in that range, generally you're talking about comparing it to a 380. So, yeah, a very small, I generally carry a full-size fighting handgun, but if I am going to ultralight carry and a non-permissive environment, which is pretty rare. But if I'm doing it, like I'm doing wind sprints or something like that, then a J-frame is hard to beat. And I've tried to beat it with small semi-autos and I haven't, but just the curvature of it, the power to weight ratio, the fact that I can have, 357 or 38 special and an 11-ounce revolver, a super lightweight Scandium revolver, that's hard to beat. If it's not a primary fighting tool, I'm carrying a rifle and I'm deep in the backcountry and I just want a small handgun for a backup, but it's not my primary, those are pretty good and hard to beat, a little small J-frame in the pocket. I think J-frames, even in the world of semi-autos, because when you get really big, like the 44 mags, the revolver tends to have some more advantage. If you go uber small, like in the realm of a J-frame versus an LCP, then I think the revolver still has a lot more advantage. If you are talking about anywhere in the middle, probably not. Probably a semi-auto is your better bet. I love, again, going back to nostalgia was the number one reason. And I think that honestly is the number one reason. Probably nostalgia, and I didn't put in there aesthetics, but probably nostalgia and aesthetics are the number one reason people like the revolver or carry a revolver. Here's the thing. I like Conestoga wagons. Or let's just go with horses. I live in an area with a lot of cowboys, a lot of cattle ranching, a lot of rough, rugged country. There are still people here that use horses. But they use horses periodically when they make sense. Even modern cowboys in America, their everyday driver going to the feed store is not a horse. They don't go to the horse, or they don't go to the feed store on a horse, right? They might use them deep in the backcountry to round up cattle still, but their daily driver is a Ford F-250 or F-350 or whatever it is, right? They don't daily drive a horse to market. Their general EDC driver, to put it that way, is an automobile. They don't only use a horse just because it's nostalgic. They have to do what's practical to make a living. So keep that in mind. Keep your nostalgia in check. If it's a life-saving tool, get what's actually better versus what you want to be cool. So just some thoughts on the revolver. They do still have a place. Again, I wouldn't say they're obsolete. I would say they're largely obsolescent. But people love revolvers, which is one of the reasons I put the post up, and I was floored by the amount of comments that I got in a day, which tells me I should probably do some content on revolvers. So here you go. Normally I'll give a tactical tip in this spot between the content and the tactical verse of the day. Today I'm going to give an opinion that kind of bucks the trend as somebody that's been carrying a revolver off and on as a backup gun or as a off-duty carry gun or as my ultralight carry for 20 years. I'm going to buck the trend here and say that I don't agree with if you're going to carry a small J-frame or something like that, it should be hammerless. I know that's the thing, like the hammer's going to get you killed, it's going to get snagged in the pocket. Well, I've been carrying those small revolvers for 20 years, and I actually prefer a hammer. I have at times had to or chose to use a single action trigger pull if I'm trying to do some fine work with a really small revolver. You can shoot pretty accurately with double action, but it's even harder when you're shooting an 11-ounce gun with a 12-pound trigger. That's not good math for accuracy. I think the advantage of having a good, crisp, single-action trigger pull available beats the disadvantage of the thought that you might snag a hammer on a pocket. Again, as somebody that's been carrying one for 20 years and has trained a bunch with it, I disagree. I do not concur with that tactical consensus. I think it's one of the things that gets said and then a bunch of people repeat it without ever having tested it. I don't think you should necessarily go with a hammerless small revolver. If you want to, fine. But I think you give up a lot and you don't gain very much. If you actually practice your draw and how you grip the gun, you can just make that a non-issue. If you just grab the gun so that your thumb is up and stopping that hammer from getting snagged, then you don't have to worry about it. And you get the benefit of having a nice trigger versus a garbage trigger or a very slow trigger. So don't think that you have to get a hammerless design. If you want a hammered design, I think they offer a lot of advantage. Just because everybody says, everybody tells me, everybody knows that, a hammered small revolver is going to get you killed. Can you actually show me a case where that's ever actually happened? And have you actually practiced and trained with it and been like, can I draw this in such a way that I don't snag, the hammer in my pocket? Can I have a holster that goes to the edge of my pocket so that's it's just a non-issue, right? And yeah, I will totally concede the vast majority of the time when you're doing defensive drills, protecting yourself with a snub-nosed revolver, good book, by the way, or maybe it's defending yourself with a snub-nosed revolver, good book. But if you are doing that, the vast majority of the time, it's going to be double action. But not always. You might want a good single action. You might have a harder shot. So that single action really can make a difference. So those are my thoughts on that. Now, for your tactical verse of the day. This is a beautiful verse. I am blessed to have a wonderful, beautiful wife inside and out. This is from Proverbs. An excellent wife is the crown of her husband. It is a great blessing to have a wife and a good wife. That is from the Lord. So, with all the garbage culture today and the hookup culture and all that stuff and all the single men out there that are getting disheartened, you can, in today's day and age, still have a wonderful wife. You can have a good, solid marriage. And it is an absolute blessing from God. So stay in that fight. And if you are happily married and have a good wife, appreciate that and thank God for that. Thanks for listening and have a blessed day.